All right, we're ready for 1 Timothy chapter 1. We just finished 2 Thessalonians and then took a break during the meeting, and now we're ready for 1 Timothy. We'll work our way through 1st and 2 Timothy. Say more about those letters, how they fit together and lace together here in just a second. Let's do some introductory things as we always do on the beginning of a book. That's always helpful. The author of the book is obviously Paul. Chapter 1 and verse 1. If our understanding of the date be correct, and I think we have a good idea generally of the date, not of a specific date, but if our understanding of the date be correct, then Paul would have been an old man. In Philemon 9, he refers to himself as Paul the Aged. This would have been written after Timothy had been left at Ephesus, and that's where Timothy is, and perhaps more about that as the chapters unfold. Let's talk a little about Timothy. So let's go to question number 1. List some things you know about Timothy, most of which will not be found in this chapter. What do you know about Timothy? Okay. All right, we know about his mother, we know about his grandmother, and we know about his dad. His dad was a Gentile. Where did he learn his faith? From his mother and his grandmother. More about them in a moment. What else do we know about Timothy? Yes, he seems to be timid. Never spelled out specifically, but implied in 2 Timothy 1. So we'll save all of that for that, but that was one of the points we wanted to make. He seems to be a little shy and a little timid. And that, therefore, some of the commands given or some of the exhortation given makes perfect sense in view of that. What else do we know about Timothy? Paul's assistant, traveled with him, he's his companion. Good reputation and good worker. All right, he was a true child in the faith. Say again. Yes, Paul calls him his son in the faith. Paul must have had some hand in his conversion. Anything else? Very young. Young is a relative matter, but he was young. And when I say young, a relative, you'll see why here in just a second. His name means honored of God. I'm going to quickly go through some of this because we want to get to the text. He was born and lived in Lystra in Iconium, where Paul would have visited on the first missionary journey and the second. His father was a Greek. His mother was Jewish. Her name was Eunice. His grandmother was Lois. They are mentioned in chapter 1 of the second letter. And so kind of a family tree. His mother and his grandmother was the ones who delivered his faith to him. That is, they taught him. His father was a Greek. We know little about him except the fact that he was indeed Greek. He was a close associate of Paul, called the son in the faith. They met on the first missionary journey. He's found again on the second missionary journey, chapter 16 and in verse 5. He joined Paul and Silas in their travels, and so he's mentioned several times in their travel. He was part of the third journey, according to Acts 19 and Acts chapter 20. He was with Paul in prison. I don't mean by that he was arrested and being imprisoned, but he was there while Paul was in prison. You remember Paul had freedom during his first imprisonment. That is, he could have guests come into his house and they could go, but he was confined. And so he was there with Paul for part of that imprisonment. During the first imprisonment. He was left at Ephesus after that. So this is where the dating comes in about our understanding of Paul's age. He left at Ephesus after that first imprisonment, and he was with Paul during the second imprisonment in 2 Timothy, which is mentioned. That seems to be a different imprisonment, though some think it's all the same. I think it's a second imprisonment, totally different from the first. So here's some things we know about Timothy himself, or some interesting facts, more than he's mentioned in 12 of the 27 books. That's quite a prominent recognition in the Bible. You stop and think about that. Some characters only mentioned once. Paul's mentioned in 12 of the 27 books. 2 of the 21 epistles are written to him. And so that's a significant amount of the New Testament written to him. He's thought to be at least 30 years old. There's some conjecture there. He's young, but based on the terms that are used, some scholars think and speculate he was in the 30-ish age bracket. and probably not much younger like we may think of in the 20s, and probably not in his 40s. And so there is some conjecture there, but that's a general common thought. He perhaps was timid, as Drew pointed out from 2 Timothy chapter 1, and so Paul kind of tries to bolster that a little bit. He had stomach trouble, and so Paul had told him, and we'll get to this in chapter 5, to drink a little wine for his stomach's sake. So we know a little bit of his physical infirmity. Talk a little about when and where the letter would have been written. We can't be certain of the place or of exactly the time, but somewhere about 63 to 64 AD, if it's after that first imprisonment and having left Paul or Timothy at Ephesus. If that be the case, that would put it about 63 to 64 AD. And then Paul would have probably been in Macedonia or Greece. Where was he exactly? I don't know in this first letter. I have a better idea of where he is in the second letter than I do the first. But nonetheless, that's about as much as we know about when and where. Now, this is important to know that there are parallel books all through the Bible. For example, the Gospels. You have the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are somewhat parallel. Sometimes John, but very little. And so we talk about parallel books. Colossians and Ephesians are parallel books. Romans and Galatians somewhat are parallel. Well, this is a parallel book. Seemed to be written at the same time. While he's sending a letter off to Timothy, he's sending a letter at the same time off to Titus, thus explaining much of the parallel. Make sense? Some similar phrases, qualifications of elders mentioned in both, but they're not identical books, but they are parallel, and we'll keep that in mind. Now, the style is quite interesting to me. And by the style, I simply mean, and I'll quote F. Harrison. I love this quotation from Harrison about the style. He said, the style is not argumentative. Romans is argumentative. Galatians is argumentative, arguing a doctrine, a point. 1 Timothy is not like that. The style is not argumentative. It lacks the rapid thrust, the passion and broken character that so often stamps the apostles' work. Here, the atmosphere is rather calm, the pace sedate, the letters are quietly instructional. He captured the thought. That is 1 Timothy in the nutshell. Questions or comments on introductory themes? Why are these books called 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus the pastoral epistles? The instructing of the evangelist. It's based on that those three books are called pastoral epistles. That phrase did not start till about 1726 to describe these books. And it would be better called the evangelistic epistles. It's because people have the concept. The term pastor refers to the preacher, the evangelist. And so these are instructions for evangelists, for preachers, of how they are to conduct themselves, what they're to preach, and how they're to preach. And so they're called pastoral epistles. So I'm not alarmed by that. I just rather call them the evangelistic epistles. Now, this is really the purpose of really 1 and 2 Timothy. And we're going to see more about this in chapter 1. But it's instruction to Timothy on what to preach and how to preach. What would the how be about? We know what to preach. You're to preach the gospel, the sound doctrine. We've got that. Don't preach your own opinion. Don't preach fables. Endless genealogies. We'll see all of that in chapter 1. What's the how? Love. With love? What else? Absolutely. Yeah, don't give any reason for that. And so don't let others take advantage of you because of your youth. We'll say more about that as we work our way through these 3 letters. What else? All right, it's to be preached with love. It's to be preached with patience. Anything else? Yes. We'll see that particularly in chapter 2 of the second letter, that you teach others who will be able to teach others also. And so that's a good point. We'll say more about that as we unfold. I'm not really happy with this outline. This is from Don DeWelt. This is as good as any that I've seen, but I think there probably is a better outline if I take the time to go back and work on that a little bit. But this is from Don DeWelt, and he just takes it basically by chapter, except separating some things in chapter 6. Chapter 1, sound doctrine. Chapter 2, public worship. Chapter 3, church officers. Chapter 4, false teachers. Chapter 5, through the first 2 verses of chapter 6, care of the members of the church, and then the minister himself for the rest of the book. Not a bad outline, there's better, but I think I just hadn't seen it yet. So how and what to teach, that's what we're going to focus on. All right, let's go to chapter 1 now and look at some things in chapter 1, then we'll go back to our questions. This is the outline that I've put together on chapter 1, and I think there are three things that are being emphasized, and I put this under the banner of the charge to Timothy concerning sound doctrine. And first of all, there's the charge concerning sound doctrine, and then there's Paul's ministry. It's an honor to preach sound doctrine, and that seems, by the way, that's kind of a parenthetical section to me to bolster the point of verses 1 through 11. More about that in a moment. And then 18 to 23, here's the charge to war the good warfare and fight the good fight. We're going to spend most of our time in the first 11 verses, so don't get excited. We're going to make it through, but we're going to kind of quickly go through 12 to 17 because of the nature of the point being made there. And we'll say more about that in a moment. So let's talk about this charge. Let's get a question or two out of the way, and then we'll come back to our outline. Question number 3. What did Paul charge Timothy to do concerning his work at Ephesus? Verses 3 and 4. All right, absolutely. And so who those others are, we'll identify in part in just a moment. So I call this section 1 through 11 the charge concerning sound doctrine. Let's get the greeting first, then we'll come back to the charge. And the point B, C, and D actually are the 3 points that summarize this section. But it's interesting that he starts on the note, Paul, an apostle, mentions his authority by the commandment of God and the Lord Jesus Christ, our hope. He points backward to the redemptive work of Christ and points forward to our hope. Looking backwards and forward or to help Titus or Timothy to be a better minister. Now at verse 2, it's not just a form of greeting. He calls Timothy my true son in the faith, but he mentions grace and mercy and peace. Timothy was in need of grace. He was in need of mercy. He's in need of peace. One writer suggests that what he's doing is he's reminding the minister of his continual need for humility. You are in need of mercy. You are in need of grace, and you are in need of mercy. May that be upon you. Recognizing that makes you a better servant. Make sense? All right. More could be said about verses 1 and 2. I'm more interested beginning at verse 3 to verse 11. Focusing on the charge concerning the doctrine, watch what he does here. He talks about the only doctrine, and that is the revealed doctrine. That's what's to be taught. Timothy, that's all you are to be teaching. And furthermore, you tell others that's all they're to be teaching. You're going to have to help work on this. Secondly, here's the purpose of the doctrine. And then thirdly, here's the scope of the doctrine. So let's talk about the only doctrine, verse 3. What does he say here at verse 3? Yeah. I urged you when I went to Macedonia, left you at Ephesus, that you may charge some that they teach no other doctrine. Now, who are the some? Well, I don't know. That seems to be a broad, the American Standard said certain men. That seems to be general, that there are certain men that need to be charged. But let's get ahead of ourselves to chapter 1 and in verse 19 and 20, or verse 20, there's Hymenaeus and Alexander. Perhaps are part of that group, or at least an example or a specific example of that. That there are some who are teaching another doctrine, and so you charge some men. Again, generally, but there's some I have in mind that they need to teach no other doctrine, which means Timothy also needs to teach no other doctrine. Now notice at verse 4, while we're talking about this, nor give heed to fables. What's a fable?
Well, it was something similar to the parables that Jesus might have used to teach, but these sound like something that men might have made up or heard. Maybe some of it.
Yeah, it's a legend. BDAG says it means a legend or a story. Don't give heed to fables. And we'll see this more in the very next phrase. Some of the historians like to love to work out some fictitious tales about cities and families and mingled fable with truth, which made it a very believable concept. And so let's footnote here, error, if it's laced in with a lot of truth, but a little bit of error, makes it easier to swallow because it sounds familiar. And then here comes that little bit of error. But be that as it may, don't give yourself unto fables, that which is untrue, that which has no basis. There were Jewish fables mentioned in Titus chapter 1. Nor endless genealogies. What would that refer to?
Pharisees and Sadducees trying to go back to teach the whole law. I would say be part of that.
Perhaps it refers to that. Some of the Jews, now it could refer to Jewish genealogies, or it could refer to the Gentile genealogies. If it's referring to Jewish, and it may have encompassed both. One of the pastime of some of the Jews was to take a Jewish name and make up family facts about that name. Just make up things, and that's part of the fable. And then argue over that. Pick up some obscure name in history and make up some things about him, and then argue with somebody who'd made up some facts about them, and you have no basis for the argument. And so here's endless genealogy. It's endless because you just can make up whatever. If you're going to make stuff up, you just make up anything you want. It may refer to Gnosticism, and we're going to say more about Gnosticism next week, not in the class, but perhaps a sermon, that they felt the world was created by a series of emanations. In other words, God could not directly create the world because of the separation of deity and matter. There is no connection. So God had to create something which created 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 something, and it goes on and on and on. And finally, then the world came about. By that series, there's endless genealogies. But either way, it's not a part of the revelation of God. That's the point I want us to see. What's the problem with that verse 4? All right, it causes disputes. English Standard, what does it mark? Speculation. That's all that it involves, rather than godly edification. There's something practical in that. What do you learn? Yeah. Don't waste your time in trying to teach someone the gospel or in Bible class or in sermons. Don't waste your time dealing with things that don't edify. Does that make sense? I think so. Yeah, don't fill classes, don't fill sermons with useless material. Have you ever sat in a Bible class where the class argues over something like, what did the author mean by question 4? Or something that when you get through, you've accomplished nothing. There is no edification in that. There is nothing. There's no substance to that. And we waste our time on useless things. And so what Paul is telling Timothy, here's the charge. Preach no other doctrine than that which has been revealed. Don't waste your time with endless genealogies. Don't waste your time with fables. All of that just is speculation that ends up not edifying. Now let's shift gears. Let's talk about the purpose of the doctrine. Here's why those are no count, no avail. If you don't get any other point, get verse 5. Verse 6 and 7 goes with it, but verse 5 is the point. You might make a marginal note if you don't already have this. Now, the purpose of the commandment is love. I want you to notice 3 things now. For the purpose of the commandment is love from a pure heart and from a pure conscience and from sincere faith. Watch for 3 things. Here's the reason, Timothy, you preach the sound doctrine, and that is that people would love from a pure heart. That is, that inwardly they will be the same as they are outwardly. There's the pure heart. That they would love God with a pure heart. That they would have a good conscience. In other words, they do what's right, what they're taught. And thirdly, they may have sincere faith. It's not a pretending faith, it's a true faith. So why is the gospel to be preached and taught? Whether it's taught in Bible class or it's preached, for 3 reasons. That people might love God, live right, number 2, and number 3, have real faith. Does that make sense? Now, Timothy, this is why you don't mess with fables. This is why you don't mess with endless genealogies, because it doesn't produce any of that. That's why we don't waste our time on things that have of no value, is because preaching is about, when you get through, people loving God, living right, and having real faith. So sometimes we wonder, why do I need this lesson that's being taught in Bible class? Or why do I need this sermon that's being taught? It has to do with helping people live right. That's why we talk about what we're not to do, that this is sin. So why do I need this on evidences? Because we want our faith to be real. Why do we need this on priorities? So that we would love God and put Him first. Does that make sense? If we don't get any other point, we got that. Our time's been well spent. So when you have a gospel meeting, or you have a preacher come, or someone to teach a Bible class, what is our expectation? It needs to be with 3 goals in mind. And what are they? Helping people love God, live right, and have real faith. Let's go over those again. We didn't get them in order clearly that time. Let's go over them again. What are the 3 things he said in verse 5? Write them in the margin of your text. Preaching is, first of all, to love God, live right, and have real faith. That would almost preach, wouldn't it? All right, verse 6. From which some, having strayed, have turned aside to idle talk. That is, some have turned aside to the fables. They've turned aside to the endless genealogies. They've turned aside to that which is useless and empty. In other words, there's no substance. That's the idea of idle talk, is that which is empty and useless and of no value. Now, verse 7 gives us another point before we get to the scope of the doctrine. Desiring to be teachers of the law, understanding neither what they say, neither what they affirm. Now, that's quite interesting to me. What does it say to you?
I see that they have the wrong motive. Think of that word desire. That's where their desire is. To be a teacher, maybe for promise.
All right. Their motive may be wrong. What else? That's good. All right, that's good. It has to be based in the revelation. You know, the scribes did this. And in Matthew 22, the scribes taught things they didn't know. Matthew 22 and in verse 29. That's why not everybody's to be a teacher, James 3 and verse 1. Be not many teachers. Here it seems their desire to teach and their confidence outstrips their knowledge. Could that happen? Have you ever known somebody that wants to teach and they have confidence to teach? They want to preach, they have confidence to preach, but their knowledge is lacking. What's the problem? Not edifying. If you're one of the elders and somebody approached you and said, I want to preach, and you recognize you've got confidence and you've got desire, but I don't think you've got the knowledge, what would you do as an elder? What would your answer be? Let's study on that. Let's work on grooming you in that direction. Are we going to put him in the pulpit? Not ready yet. Yeah. Here's a practical lesson to learn from that. Teaching is not a time for guesswork and taking a shot in the dark when we have no idea what the text or the context means. If you teach a Bible class, if you go to class, I don't care what age group you're teaching, and you don't have a clue what the text is about, let someone else go in and help you with that, because that is not a time for guesswork. It's not a time to read the text and say, I don't have a clue what this means. I'm just going to guess. You're one of the elders. What are you going to say to that? The teacher says, I'm just going to go in here and guess. I don't have a clue what this is about, but I'm just going to go in here and kind of guess at it.
I'll say no, but we may help you and teach you so you might be ready for it in the future.
Absolutely.
I say, let me do it for you.
Absolutely. Let's go back to verse 5. Now, why is that dangerous? Teaching without knowledge. Because the purpose of teaching is not, I'm not there to entertain. It's not just to help somebody grow. That is, the teacher just to grow. But I'm trying to help people love God, live right. And what was the third? Have real faith. They may not have real faith if I don't guide them properly. And they may not live right if I don't guide them properly. That's why verse 7 connects with how verse 7 connects with verse 8. All right, verse 5. Yes, ma'am.
Connection, modern connection. Now look at 6 and 7. For some men straying from these things have turned aside to fruitless discussion. If I were to add on the internet, that is so home today, wanting to be teachers of the law, even though they don't understand either what they're saying, the grammatics by which they make confident assertions. And I would even say we could add men and women.
Yes.
So as we look at, in their day, the only way to teach was face to face, but in our day, we have false teachers in a lot of different places.
Good point. I'm not opposed to some of the discussion that goes on the internet, some of the debate that goes on the internet. I don't delve into that for two reasons. One is, number one, it's endless. Number two is, I've only been preaching 40 years. There's some subjects I'm not prepared on the spur of the moment to delve into. So here's a discussion going on evolution. Can I defend the truth? Yes. I'm going to prepare for that. I'm not going to, on the spur of the moment, I see a discussion on evolution, I'm going to jump in the fray. I'm not prepared for that. And the same thing is true on any subject. Divorce and remarriage, I've done my homework on that. But I want to tell you, I'm not jumping in the middle of a discussion without stopping and doing some preparation. And by that time, that discussion's moved on. I stay out of the fray because I don't feel prepared to jump into that. Now, maybe you are, but I'm not. All right, so much for my preaching there. Let's go to question number 4. What is meant by the law is not made for the righteous person? That's a tough one.
That's just like Jesus said, that he didn't come to earth to save the righteous. He come to save the sinner. This is along with those lines.
Okay, I'm looking for a translation here. In part, that may be what he's talking about. Let's focus on the scope now of the doctrine. The surface reading of the text, the law is not made for the righteous, but for the lawless. In other words, it sounds like the law is not for, if you live righteous, the law is not for you. Well, that can't be what it's saying because we're all under law, are we not? So if I'm not under law, there's no way to commit sin because sin is a transgression of the law. So if I'm not under law, then there's no way for me to sin. I'm a righteous person, so I can't sin because I'm not under law. Law's not for me. That don't make sense. We are under law. 1 John 3 and verse 4. James 1 and verse 25. Because of what he mentions in the verses following, notice he says that if law is good if one uses it lawfully. Nothing wrong with the law. That's the point of verse 8. But the law is not made for the righteous man, but for the lawless and insubordinate. What does it mean, made for? Clark argues that it means literally to lie against. I was looking for my translation here. Let me bring that back up. This is Young's literal. It's like the American Standard and some of the others that are more wooden. It says, having known this, that for a righteous man, law is not set. In other words, the law is set. What do you mean it's set? The penalties of the law sets against. Let's take, for example, just law in general. Let's take the speeding law that says 55. You drive 55. Jared, are you going to stop me if I'm doing 55? What if I'm doing 75? You going to stop me? Why? Because that law about 55, is it setting against me driving at 55? It's setting against me if I violate the law. Make sense? All right, if we understand that, so that law is not set against those who want to obey the law. So I look at the speed limit and it says 55 miles an hour. And so I'm not worried about that if I'm driving 55 miles an hour. But if I'm wanting to drive 80 through that speed zone, I better be worried because that law sets against me. The penalties of that law is against me. It's not against me if I'm obeying the law. It's setting against me. And so it literally has the idea of lying against. Now, with that in mind, see if it doesn't make sense. Let me paraphrase verse 8. Verse 8 basically saying the problem isn't the law, folks. I know there's more to verse 8 than that, but the problem isn't the law. That ain't it. Look at verse 9. Knowing this, that the law is not lying against the righteous man. but against the lawless and the insubordinate. Well, sure, I understand that now. And the ungodly and the sinners and the unholy and the profane and the murderers of fathers and murderers of mothers and the manslayer. And against the fornicator and the sodomites and the kidnapper and the liars and the perjurers. And if there any other thing that's contrary to sound doctrine, there's the law he's talking about. Sound doctrine. According to the glorious gospel. The gospel and sound doctrine are synonymous. We'll come back to that in a second. The blessed God which is committed to my trust. So it's in the flow of this doctrine. Timothy, the charge is you preach the doctrine, the only doctrine. Don't be messing with other stuff. The purpose of that, threefold that we just mentioned at verse 5. And then here's the scope of the doctrine. The penalties of the law does not lie against those who are ungodly, against the righteous. It's against the ungodly. That's why we preach, so that we get them out of the ungodliness and bring them to righteousness. Because the purpose of the law is that men might love God, live right, and have true faith. Make sense? Now, I'm not going to take the time to go through each one of these sins mentioned here in interest of time. But if there's a question about one of those, and you say, I'm not sure what that is, maybe I'll make a stab at that and see. Or somebody else can. Notice the kinds of sins that are mentioned, from murder to fornication to kidnappers to liars. There's not much difference in a liar and a sodomite in God's eyes. The law lies against them all. Now, just for a footnote, you might underline, you may have this done, you should have this from a previous study. Underline the word doctrine at verse 10 and the word gospel at verse 11. Draw a line connecting them, because the gospel and the doctrine are one and the same. When somebody comes along, starts talking about the core gospel, raise your ears up and you better be listening carefully, because he's probably about to make a distinction between the gospel and doctrine and tell you they're not the same. He's going to tell you you need to be united on the gospel, but you can be divided on the doctrine. You have to believe the gospel. You don't have to accept the doctrine. And so that's why then we can have unity and diversity. That's where that's coming from. There's a whole system of doctrines, plural, built on the gospel doctrine distinction. From the Haley concept of marriage, he had the gospel doctrine distinction, to the catcher side, no preacher, to the catcher side, unity and diversity, the whole spectrum made a gospel doctrine distinction. They're the same here in this text. All right. Now, I said we'd spend most of our time there, and we did, so I was true to my word. Let's go to 12 to 17 now. Let's see how this fits. What I want you to see here in 12 to 17, this is not a digression, but an enforcement of the charge to Timothy. To saying it's an honor and a privilege to have this charge, Timothy. I'm charging you to preach the gospel. And this is an honorable charge. And there's no greater preparation for preaching or any other task, for that matter, than to realize our own unworthiness to have that task. Does that make sense? In other words, you're given a task, and your attitude is kind of like, well, they are the ones that are privileged to have me to do this for them. You're not worth anything. But if you approach it with what an honor it is for me to be given the charge, and that's what Paul's trying to tell Timothy. So let's quickly go through this. That's his whole point about himself. Is Timothy, this is an honor and a privilege. And he said, I'm thankful to God to be enabled. Look at verse 12. I'm thankful to God to be enabled, that he counted me faithful to put me in the ministry. Well, what makes you so saying it's so honorable? Well, I used to be a sinner. Look at verse 13. I was a blasphemer, an insolent man. That is, I was arrogant, violently arrogant, your footnote will say. But I obtained mercy. Look at verse 15. Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I'm chief. I was the worst of sinners. And yet God had mercy on me, and he gave me mercy that I might be a pattern to those who would later believe unto everlasting life. And verse 17 is basically saying, may glory be given to God for that. Here, I want you to get the thrust of the section, more than the details, that Paul is saying, Timothy, I've given you the charge to preach. I want to tell you what an honor it is. Look at me, that God put me in the ministry. Does that make sense? This bolsters his point of verses 1 through 11. Make sense? He does. He does. He does. Anything on that before we get to the last few verses? We've got about 5 minutes to go, 4 minutes to go, and we can make our goal here. Very good point. It was set against him, and it no longer is because he's living righteous. And look.
I think too that Paul uses this illustration, and it should give anybody a lot of hope. Because what kind of sin could you do that would be worse than killing Christians and destroying the church and everything like that? And Paul says, "Look at me, I was the worst, and yet Christ decided that I was worthwhile, and look what I'm doing."
Exactly. Good point.
That's why the preaching needs to be what it needs to be. Because the fables and all the rambling and babbling and janglings, that ain't going to change people.
Yeah. Fluff isn't going to do it. Fluff isn't going to cut it. It's got to be book, chapter, and verse. Now let's get this last section here. This is the charge to war a good warfare and to fight a good fight. So there's 2 or 3 things we want to say about this at verse 18 and 19 and 20. I think we've got time to do it. That I charge you, my son Timothy, according to the prophecies previously made concerning you. Who is that talking about? Probably New Testament prophets. We know nothing about when or what they said, but apparently New Testament prophets had said something about Timothy, and that ought to encourage Timothy that New Testament prophets had foretold and mentioned or said something about you and your work, that by them you may wage a good warfare. Now we could camp on verse 19, but I want to talk about the warfare. Timothy is signed up to be a preacher of the gospel, and part of that is being a soldier. And Ephesians 6 says if you signed up to be a Christian, you signed up to be a soldier. I want you to think just for a moment what it would be like for somebody says, I want to sign up and join the army. So they go and they sign up for the army. They get enlisted. And they get off boot camp, get out of boot camp. Next thing you know, they're sent to a war zone. And they say, whoa. I'm not much on fighting. What are you going to say to them? That's what the army's about, isn't it? Isn't that what armies are for? Isn't that what our military is for, is fighting? Whether you agree with warfare or not, that's what military is for, isn't it? Is that right, Ricky? You've been in the military. Education, for the money. But you've joined an army, and armies are for fighting. Aren't you signed up to preach the gospel, and you signed up to teach the Bible class, and you signed up to be a Christian? You signed up in an army. You don't want to fight? This ain't for you. Because Paul told Timothy, look at verse 18 again, that I charge you that you may wage a good warfare. We're in a fight against sin. We're in a fight against Satan because the law lies against the ungodly and the sinner and the et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We saw that earlier. Having faith and a good conscience, which some having rejected concerning the faith have suffered shipwreck. That's one of the most horrific pictures of destruction is the first century shipwreck. If you could picture a wooden ship just scattered to pieces, just bursted all to pieces and scattered everywhere. I've got a slide, but I won't take the time to hunt it down up there. But some have made shipwreck of the faith. That's why you need to wage the good warfare. And then he mentions 2 people, Hymenaeus and Alexander. What do we know about them? Yes, they're part of the problem. These probably are the same concept that we read about in 2 Timothy chapter 2. Hymenaeus is mentioned, 2 Timothy 2 in verse 17. Alexander is mentioned, is it the same? Maybe. In chapter 4, 2 Timothy, verse 14. Hymenaeus had taught the resurrection is past already, 2 Timothy 2:18. And it may be that same doctrine. I don't know. Maybe they had taught another doctrine at this point. But whatever it is that they were teaching, it was contrary to sound doctrine. And that's why Paul tells Timothy, you've got to fight. that make sense? What's the danger of letting Hymenaeus and Alexander continue their doctrine and Timothy over here just talking about what he wants to, but never attacks that doctrine? What's the danger of that? Say again louder. That's a good point. Say again. And everybody else's too. Good point. We're going to end on that. Good point.